Hello, in this video we are going to learn how to label compounds. But first we need to know what is a compound. So a compound, it is formed when we have two or more elements that are combined together in a fixed ratio. For example, if we have magnesium combining with chlorine, this is going to form what we call magnesium chloride. But now, how do we know that we need two chlorines to bond them with magnesium? So this is a theory that we are going to cover on the next video. In this video, we only want to learn how to name a compound. So a compound, it is this that is formed when we combine elements. So we have different types of compound, but this type of a compound here, it is called an ionic compound. So this is an ionic compound because we have a metal that is bonding with a non-metal. So if we have a metal and a non-metal, that is called an ionic compound. And this ionic compound, it is formed when a metal and a non-metal combine. So let us first start to learn how to actually label an ionic compound. But first, we need to understand how do we know which element is a metal and which element is a non-metal. All this is actually grouped in a periodic table. So in a periodic table, we have different types of elements that are arranged in a specific way that will help us to actually know what is a metal and what is not a metal. So on the first two groups, we have what you call metals. But please be careful to note that hydrogen is not a metal, even though it's in the first group. So here we have metals. And then on this right-hand side of ours, we have non-metals. Remember, we said what? We said hydrogen is a non-metal. So all these other types of elements that are left behind are also having specific groups. For example, all these are also metals, but we call them transitional metals. So we are not going to focus on them in this video. We also have these ones that are colored in green. We call them metalloids. So these are elements that can actually behave as a metal and a non-metal. So what we need to know in this video is these two groups, which are called metals, and also these other elements on the right hand side of the periodic table, which are called non-metals. So for example, we said magnesium is a metal, and then it was bonded together with a chlorine, which is a non-metal. So that is why we said we have an ionic bonding. So now, remember, ionic compound consists of what? Of a metal and a non-metal. So we said the compound that is formed when magnesium bond together with chlorine is Mg chlorine 2. So but now, how do we actually name this a compound? For us to name the compound, the first thing that we need to know is that we need to label the metal as it is. So remember, the metal is the one that always starts on the equation or on the formula, and then it is also the one that is on the right of the periodic table. So we start first by labeling the metal. So you write the full name of the metal. So this metal that we have is magnesium. So we're just going to write, we have what? We have magnesium. So the second part, which is chlorine, we are going to label it. But now, when we label the chlorine, which is a non-metal, we are going to change the ending. So the ending of chlorine, it's actually ending with I-N-E, but we will change it to I-D-E. So remember, the name of this is called chlorine. But now when we write it as a ionic compound, or in each and every compound, the ending will always be chloride. Okay, so for us to actually give a full name of this compound, we are going to say this compound is called magnesium chloride. So we're just going to name it to say this is magnesium chloride. Okay, so we can look at a few more examples of ionic compound so that we can get a clear picture of ionic compounds. Let's say, for example, we have this type of an element here. So we have Kf. So that means we have potassium bonded with fluorine. So how can we actually name this type of an element? So remember, the first part is a metal, so we just name it as it is. So this is called a potassium. The second part, which is fluorine, we're just gonna change the last ending part. Remember, this is called, it is labeled a fluorine, but we're gonna change this INE to fluoride. So this is gonna be potassium fluoride. So that is how we label ionic compounds. So let us do one more example. Let's say, for example, we have lithium oxide. So now, how do we actually label this part? Remember, we do the very same thing. We say the first part that we have is a metal, so we just want to write the name of it as it is. It doesn't matter what we have as a number at the bottom or a number as a coefficient. That is not important. We're just going to name the first element, which is lithium. So we're just going to say we have lithium. And then the last part is what? Is oxygen. So remember, oxygen, we're just going to change the last part and write it with IDE. So this is going to be lithium oxide. So I hope you get the idea of how to label an ionic compound. So let us now move on to talk about a covalent compound. So a covalent compound, it is also known as a molecular compound. So what is equivalent compound? So this is a type of a compound whereby we have a non-metal bonding with a non-metal. For example, we can have hydrogen bonding with oxygen, and this is going to give us H2O. But remember, we don't know now for sure why is it that we need two hydrogens to bond with one oxygen. But that theory will be covered in the next video. So in this type of a compound or a bonding, we have a covalent compound because we have two nonmetals bonding together. So now, how do we actually label or name a covalent compound? Remember, covalent and molecular compound is the same thing. So now, to name or label this type of a compound, we need to know what we call prefix. For example, if we have 2 hydrogens or 1 oxygens, we need to know how to actually name that. So it is important to name that when we have a covalent compound. So if ever we have 1 element, we call that mono. If we have 2 elements, that is di. If we have 3 elements, that is tri. If we have 4 elements, that is tetra. If we have 5 elements, that is penta. And if we have 6 is hexa. 7 is hepta. Then 8 is octa. 9 is nona. And then 10 is deca. Okay, so these are the prefixes that you need to know by heart, because when you label covalent compounds, you need to know the prefix. For example, if we want to label this compound that we have here, which is H2O, we are going to name, remember the first element, we write it as it is. So the first element is hydrogen. But now we are going to take into case how many hydrogens we have. So in this case, we have 2 hydrogens. So we are going to write the prefix as di, because 2 means di. So this is going to be dihydrogen. Okay? And then the last element, remember, you always change the last part. The last part is always going to be "ide." Okay, so now what do we have on the last part is only 1 oxygen. So this is called dihydrogen monoxide. Monoxide. Okay. So we are already having something that we need to learn here. So do you see now, if we put the prefix of mono and the last part of the oxide, what is going to happen is that we have 2 O's. So this is just going to be dihydrogen monoxide. So it is kind of hard to actually pronounce this. So if we have 2 O's in between, or we have O, A and O, we just write them as 1 O. So instead of writing monoxide, we just write this is dihydrogen monoxide. So dihydrogen monoxide, it is also known as water because that is H2O. So you can, another name is water. Okay, so that is how we actually label covalent compounds. Remember, covalent means molecular compound. Let's say, for example, we want to label the following covalent compound. We have CO2. So what is happening is that the first element, we just label it as it is. But you need to remember this. When the first element, it is only 1 element. That means it does not have more than 1 element. The prefix of mono is not necessary to write it. We don't have to write monocarbon. We're just going to write it as carbon, because it is what? Is the first element, is the one that is starting. If it is not starting, you can write the mono like we did on that part. But if it is the first element, you don't write the mono, you just write the carbon. Remember, you write the name as it is. But now, if you look at the second part here, what do we have? We have 2 oxygens, and then 2, we refer to it as di. So this is just going to be dioxide. Remember, the last one, the last element will always change to IDE. Okay, so the reason why we are labeling it this way is because we have 2 nonmetals. So remember, carbon is a nonmetal and oxygen is a nonmetal. And then also here, hydrogen is a nonmetal and oxygen is a nonmetal. So that is why we label them the way we label them. But if ever we were labeling ionic compound, we will just label them as we did on the ionic metals. So now let us look at few more examples. Let's say, for example, we want to label PCl3. So remember, we said if the first element does not have many elements, it's just one element, we don't have to write the prefix of mono. So we're just going to write it as it is. And then P, it stands for what? For phosphorus. So we're just going to write this is going to be phosphorus. And then we come to the last part, which is chlorine. But remember, chlorine, we change it to be chloride. But how many chlorines do we have? We have 3 of them. So we're going to write the prefix of what? Of tri. So this is going to be phosphorus trichloride. Okay, so that will be the name of that element. So let us look at the next one. So let's say, for example, you can pause and try to do this and then see if you are able to get it. Let's say we have N2O4. So how do we label this? Remember, we're going to look at the first element. The first element is nitrogen. Nitrogen, we're just going to write it as it is. But how many nitrogens do we have? We have 2 of them. So what do we have to write? We have to write dinitrogen. And then we look at the last element. This is oxygen. We know it's going to be oxide. But how many oxygens do we have? It's 4 of them. And 4 means what? Means tetra. So this is going to be tetra. And then it's going to be oxide. And then remember, if you have AO, you can write it as just O. So you're just going to remove everything here and just write O. So if you want to pronounce this, this is going to be dinitrogen tetroxide. So that is how you are going to name that covalent compound, that molecular compound. So the last one that we can look at is if we have IF7. So remember, if we have the first element as just one element, we don't have to write the prefix mono. We're just going to write it as it is. So remember, I means iodine. So we're just going to write iodine. And then we look at the last part. Last part, we have fluorine. So remember, fluorine will change to fluoride. But now, how many fluorines do we have? We have 7 of them. And then 7 means what? 7 means hept. So this is going to be hepta fluoride. Okay, so that is how you label the molecular compounds. So that is all for this video. Thank you very much.